Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about chapter 18 of our book, and in this chapter, we're listening to Ron's story. And so it's August 1997. Governor Hunt signed a new compensation bill entitling him to $10,000 a year for every year he spent wrongfully incarcerated. The unfortunate thing is that part of those 11 years um, was being in jail, not necessarily prison. And so the state said, we're not going to pay you for jail time. So in the end, he was given $109,150.69. So ask yourself, is that still enough for being wrongfully convicted and in prison for 11 years? Did he receive enough? And then that money he used to buy land. They bought a modular home that they put on that land, and they found out that Robin was pregnant. And so things were going well for them. He says he could sit outside and enjoy the peace and quiet in nature. He took a new job at a plant, and he took the late shift for more money. One of the ways that he would relax after work is by going to a karaoke bar. And a lot of times, even after that, he would go home to watch TV. He said, I didn't like to sleep much. Life just seemed too short. And then Robin's water breaks. And I find this interesting. On the way to the hospital, they come upon a red light, and she's telling him to floor it, just go through it. And he says, it was the middle of the night, but I couldn't do it. I didn't want us to get T-boned in the intersection, and you never knew what cops might be around looking for drunks. And so, for him, he's still making sure that he's, you know, behaving, so to speak, so that nobody is out to get him. And so they end up having a little girl. He says, we named her Raven for the head full of dark hair she had, a real TWA, teeny weeny afro. And just looking at her, my heart felt so full, it actually hurt. And then eventually, a few weeks later, they go and introduce their daughter to his mom. And we see there a little bit that his mom is deteriorating in health as well. And then at the bottom of 260, he comes face to face with the prosecutor from the second trial. He says, one afternoon, as I stood in line at John's, Robin had asked me to pick up some egg sandwiches. I realized I was standing behind Luke Turner, the prosecutor from the second trial. And John there, he knows Ron. And so Turner's trying to buy a pack of cigarettes, and John says, can I see some ID? And Turner says, you know I'm old enough to buy cigarettes. To which John says, only thing I know about you is you don't know right from wrong, putting an innocent man in prison. Mr. Turner stiffened through his back and then turned around as if to see who could have heard what John said. And when he looked over his shoulder, there I was. He quickly turned back around and put some money down on the counter before walking out. No apology, nothing. He simply got into his black Mercedes and sped off. The other person who never apologized to me was Sully, the police officer who seemed to think that because I had dated white women, I had to be a rapist. A lot of people wondered why it even mattered to me once I was free, but it did matter. I had no choice but to stand there in court and face the accusations, defend myself the best I could. I had no choice but to keep fighting and accept that God had a reason for me to go through what I had. I didn't try and escape. I earned my freedom through the courts that had incarcerated me. It only seemed fair that people who had a hand in putting me there should have to face what they had done. And that's part of the problem with our criminal justice system, is that a lot of times they don't. And in this case, freeing Ronald actually ended up catching the real killer. But there's a lot of wrongful conviction cases where the wrongfully convicted get released, but they never catch the real criminal in the case. And that's really, I think it's sad, but I understand that, you know, DAs and detectives, they have a lot of cases. And I was reading in a book recently about the Black Dahlia case. It was a woman who was murdered in California in 1947, and it was a really brutal murder. You can look it up, but I won't go into detail about it. Um, but in that case, there was a family member who believes that his father was the killer. And so he wrote a book about his investigation. And the guy who wrote the book, was a police officer, a LAPD police officer. And one of the things he said is when detectives close out a case, it means they've had an arrest made. Not that they've been found guilty or anything, there's been an arrest made. Um, and so even if that person doesn't get found guilty of anything, it's still a closed case. They never go back to it. And so I think that's a procedure that needs to be looked at, that needs to be changed, that sure, at the detective's end, the case might be closed because they made an arrest, but if that doesn't go through, or if new testing comes up that, wait a minute, this wasn't the right guy, then that case needs to go back to be reopened. Um, and so a lot of times we have a lot of cold case units now in police departments to go back to these kind of cases to take another look at what's going on. Ron says at the bottom of 261, I was glad there were no hard feelings between us, meaning him and Jennifer, and I hoped she would go on to have a good life. We both had to start over in a way. And so every time she had an interview coming up, she would always ask him for consent. Is it okay that I talk about this? And he says, it got to where we talked on the phone very often. Eventually my heart adjusted to where I thought of her as a friend. I knew she was still coping, still struggling to forgive herself. I could hear it in her voice. And then they both had an interview they agreed to do in Seattle, and this was the first time that they were going to be alone together. They go for a walk, and there is a scary moment, and he tells her, don't you know I never let anyone harm a hair on your head? So, they bonded as friends through that trip. And then every year on June 30th, Tom, his lawyer, calls Ron to say happy anniversary. And Ron says, I don't try to look too far ahead, and once I got out, I never wanted to look back. Only after many years had passed was I able to see the long road I had traveled, all the changes that I had made, some good and some bad. As long as I kept on moving forward, I knew I'd be okay, but Jennifer couldn't stop looking back. Remember, she's still feeling that being caged in. She wanted some kind of closure by meeting with Bobby Poole, but from my experience with him, I don't think it would have helped her. I had looked into his eyes and asked him directly if he had anything to do with the crimes. He had sat on the witness stand with the 2 women he had raped sitting right there in the courtroom and me sitting at the other table and denied everything. He was a liar, pure and simple, and I think even if he'd granted her request for a meeting, he would have lied to her face. She would have found his eyes empty, like the dead man he nearly was. So when I read in the local paper that Bobby Poole died, I cut it out so I could send it to Jennifer. It wasn't closure, but it was an ending. And then they include the letter he wrote to her, and he says in the letter, I hope now that life will be more at ease for you and you can free your mind from the many things that bother you about this case. And so, yeah, they never really get a closure on Bobby Poole's story, of why this all happened. If you watch a TV show like Criminal Minds, they actually have former FBI profilers on there, especially one called Jim Clemente, who helps with the writing and the cases that they present. And a lot of those cases are based on real cases that the FBI have covered. And one of the things that they always kind of seem to talk about and try to represent is what is the story of this criminal? How do they go from a baby being born to the worst criminal act that they can do? How, what's that story in between there? And a lot of times we don't want to know that story. We just want to lock them up, throw away the key kind of thing. But in order to understand people and to understand us as humans, we need to understand that path. And that's kind of that human spectrum for us. We've got Mother Teresa at one end, and then you've got Ted Bundy at the other. And unfortunately, all of it's human. Given certain circumstances, we can all kill. But we also have mechanisms put in place within ourselves that prevent us becoming Ted Bundy. But not everybody does. And so there's always that talk about the nature versus nurture. Are we born to be Ted Bundy, or does something happen where we're grown up and we're put into circumstances that make that Ted Bundy? Or some people have said maybe it's a little both. Maybe we have certain genes that go towards that, But if you're raised in a loving home environment, you might not become Ted Bundy. But if you're not raised in that kind of home, maybe you do. So it's still something to think about. People are still debating that topic. Um, but it's always, again, especially with wrongful convictions, we know that we have put to death innocent people. And we know that we've incarcerated innocent people. And so the idea is we need to do a better job with our criminal justice system to prevent those things from happening further. Alrighty, that is chapter 18. And now we're on to the next video for chapter 19.